Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another webinar at the National Library of Scotland. My name is Kenny Redpath and I'm the Events Officer at the Library. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce Lisa Williams, who is here to give a talk on race and the Scottish Enlightenment. Lisa is the founder and director of the Edinburgh Caribbean Association that promotes Caribbean culture in Scotland. She runs Black History Walks in Edinburgh and gives talks and school visits to encourage greater understanding of Scotland's Black heritage. With a BA in Social Psychology and African and Asian Studies, currently studying for an MA in Arts, Festival and Cultural Management. She is also an Honorary Fellow in the School of History, Classics and Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. So without further ado, hopefully over to you, Lisa.
Hello and good evening to everyone, and Kenny, thank you very much for the lovely introduction. So I'll just give you an idea of why I decided to do this talk in the first place. So the idea for the talk originally began on a visit to the exhibition of the Enlightenment at the NLS earlier on this year. And it was actually originally with Natasha Ruona, who I've been working with, who I've been in discussions with because she'd been working with the Uncover Ed student research collective at Edinburgh University. And we found that we've been swapping quite a bit of research over with one another. Now, if you have a wee look at this panel, this was the panel in the corner of the exhibition that got our interest because it mentions the 34,000 Scots who go out to the Caribbean. They're part of the slave trade system, but also wanted people to think about the fact that Scots had actually been involved in the slave trade system all the way from the 1670s to the 1880s in places like Brazil as well. You might not be able to see the panel very well here, but like I was saying, it mentions the 34,000 Scots who went out to the West Indies to work on plantations, but we also need to think about this in the context of the entire slave trade system and people who were also importing and exporting slave trade produce, which went on right until the 1880s when slavery ended in Brazil in 1888. Now, there is a mention here of David Hume's infamous footnote on his Of National Characters essay. And this was revised in 1753, and we're going to be looking at this a little bit later on. Now, I actually mention this on the walks, the history walks that I do. Sometimes I get people to actually read out that footnote, which I don't always like doing, but people are quite shocked often if they don't know that he has written that footnote. It has been highlighted by activists more recently and highlighted by students at Edinburgh University, and discussions are being had about whether the building, the David Hume building, should remain named after David Hume. Now, I'm not an expert in the Enlightenment by any means. Some of the viewers tonight will be, and some of you might be potentially new to this material completely. I've always been interested in how ideas of liberty can coexist in systems that also are enacting repression and are involved in things like slavery and genocide as well. So if we just have a quick look at some of the areas where most of these arguments revolved around, and this is a very basic kind of 101. So stadial theory, explaining the natural course of development of societies and civilizations by stages, and Europeans, of course, often being the only dynamic ones or the ones that have progressed the most. So if we look at people like William Robertson and Adam Smith and John Miller, for example, they all were proponents of stadial theory. And generally, the idea was that once the New World was advanced enough that slavery would just sort of wither away when it wasn't needed anymore. Monogenesis versus polygenesis. So in a nutshell, monogenesis being humans being descended from a single origin, so coming from ideas from the Bible, for example, and also polygenesis, the opposite, humans coming from different progenitors and actually developing into different species. Of course, this is very useful to justify chattel slavery, and we need to define chattel slavery in being different from other forms of slavery. So the Atlantic form of slavery, chattel slavery, differs from other forms because in this system, people are stripped of all protections under civil law. So if we look at the Barbados Slave Code of 1661, which declares that a slave has no right to life, and the legislation around slavery becomes racialized around this time, it starts to become, the idea of race starts to become different from the original meaning of race up until about the 18th century. So it's similar, more similar to the Latin idea of gens, tribe or nation or family lineage, for example. So polygenesis, you have the most extreme proponent of polygenesis was Lord Monboddo, famously as an eccentric, James Burnet. He was ridiculed generally by other people, including Lord Keynes, who also actually was a proponent of polygenesis, but in a much less extreme way. Lord Monboddo had an idea about orangutans being a form of human beings, but the problematic area was he would throw in this provocation about black people being closer to orangutans, allegations of copulation of orangutans and African girls, for example. So quite strange, but some of these ideas we're still living with today. Nature, of course, versus culture is something that's at the heart of this. So the idea of race begins to harden into something that is fixed, something that's natural, as of course we'll see with David Hume. And then so many discussions, of course, around slavery, the moral and economic concerns of slavery. Very few of the Enlightenment philosophers actually agitated for abolition. Of course, it's just before the abolition movement really gets going with the evangelicals. I'm really preferring to let it wither away, become something that's useless and naturally wither away on its own accord. Now, Hume does say that it's barbaric, as does Smith. Smith's, of course, against it on economic grounds as well. James Beattie up in Aberdeen is one of the strongest critics, but he's quite fearful about speaking out and publishing up until about 1792, because, of course, you will get a lot of kickback, a lot of criticism from other people, and your career might suffer. Miller supported Wilberforce when you get to 1792. And then, of course, you get people like Monboddo, who, as might be expected, is pro-slavery. So there's quite a range. So if we go to our next slide, of course, everyone's going to know who David Hume is. Not everybody might not know who Francis Williams is. So he's the person in the portrait on the right. Francis Williams, we're going to talk about after we read out David Hume's infamous footnote, because he does actually make a reference to him at the end of it. So let's just go straight to the footnote. I am apt to suspect the Negroes, and in general all the other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation. No ingenious manufactures amongst them, no arts, no sciences. On the other hand, the most rude and barbarous of the whites, such as the ancient Germans, the present Tartars, still have something eminent about them, in their valour, form of government, or some other particular. Such a uniform and constant difference could not happen in so many countries and ages if nature had not made an original distinction betwixt these breeds of men. Not to mention our colonies, there are Negro slaves dispersed all over Europe, of which none ever discovered any symptoms of ingenuity, though low people without education will start up amongst us and distinguish themselves in every profession. Now in Jamaica, indeed, they talk of one Negro as a man of parts and learning, which is likely he is admired for very slender accomplishments, like a parrot who speaks a few words plainly. And this is of his revised footnote in his version of his 1753 version of National Characters. So rather than a throwaway comment, it's something that he's actually gone over and considered and revised several times. So Francis William, who was a scholar and a poet, born around 1702, died in 1770, and he was in an unusual situation that he was born to free black parents in Jamaica. And he becomes educated in Britain. He's sponsored by John II, Duke of Montagu, who's also sponsored some men of African heritage as well, so he wasn't the only one. He became a British citizen in 1723. And then when he goes back to Jamaica, he is rejected from a government position, probably because of his colour. So he ends up founding a free school for black children where he teaches English and maths and Latin. Now, he is presumed to have actually studied at Cambridge University. We have no definite record of him at the university, but that is something that's very, very possible. And he wrote his poetry in Latin as well. So it's very likely that David Hume would have known not just about him, but also some other men that were sent to Europe to be educated and had various achievements. Now, there were critiques of Hume's racist theory, not just now, of course, but really from the very beginning. We can look at James Africanus Beale Horton, who was a doctor, graduated from Edinburgh University in 1859. And again, if you look at Uncover Ed's work, you'll see the research they've done on him. And he critiqued Hume's work just a few decades afterwards. An interesting man who was born in Sierra Leone in 1835. He was a child of liberated people. He was educated by the Church Missionary Society, and so the British War Office actually sent him to London, and then he came up to Edinburgh to finish off his studies. And he was one of the very first African officers in the British Army, and he also ended up founding the Commercial Bank of Sierra Leone. He was a prolific writer, he was a philanthropist, and the first African graduate from Edinburgh University. And his thesis was The Medical Topography of West Africa. So he critiques Hume even while he's at university. So phrenology is in full swing by that point. There's a lot of measuring of skulls that's going on. So in the context of this measuring of skulls and trying to bring out racial difference through these kinds of experiments, he basically said there is no difference between people, skulls of people from different places. And also the fact that nations tend to rise and fall, they generally are not static. So if we even look at James Beattie, if we're looking at the Enlightenment in 1770, he critiques him in an essay on nature and the immutability of truth. And he basically says that Hume really couldn't have known this. He brings up Peruvian civilizations, the Mexican Empire. He says that Africans and Americans also have arts and manufactures too. And if you actually look at the travelers that come back from those places, they say very different things from what Hume is saying. So Hume actually goes back later towards the end of his life. After this becomes very public because it gets reprinted in the Gentleman's Magazine in 1771. And Hume revises it to just Negroes rather than talking about anyone else. So go to the next slide. We're also going to look at another philosopher who is called Anton Wilhelm Amo, who was an Enlightenment philosopher originally from Ghana and ended up going to Germany as a very young boy. And again, he's in the news at the moment because he's just about to be honoured with a street sign in Berlin. He lived in the household of the Duke of, I'm going to hopefully pronounce this properly, the Duke of Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel, and he went on to teach at the universities of Halle and Jena. So in 1734, the University of Wittenberg, he defended a thesis called On the Impassivity of Human Mind, where he actually critiques Descartes, and he actually goes further than Descartes in a way. He says the mind does not sense material things, as the mind does not contain the faculty of sensing. Sensation can only be cognized by mind and through the body. In 1734, he writes another one called The Concrete Idea. And then again, another one in 1738. I forgot a very long title, I'm just going to call it The Treatise, and about logic, which was said to be very original for its time. Now, there is some controversy that right back in 1729 at Halle University, there's a Halle University bulletin that actually mentions him defending a legal dissertation on the rights of Moors in Europe. Now, the actual paper itself is missing, but there's mention of it in the bulletin. So this is the man who spoke numerous classical and modern languages, so including, of course, Greek and Latin and Hebrew. And eventually, after he's been celebrated in Germany and throughout Europe, the Duke dies, he loses his sponsor, and he goes back to Ghana, he goes back to where he originally came from. The atmosphere is also starting to turn against him a little bit at that point. He's writing some controversial things, and the welcoming atmosphere that he has is starting to disappear. He also has a brother who ends up being enslaved in Suriname, but he goes back to find his father and his sister still alive, and he becomes a very well-respected sage. It's almost like he goes back to the original traditions that he would have come from originally. He uses astrology, he uses astronomy, and becomes almost like a diviner and like a very well-respected sage in the village that he goes back to. So I'm going to very briefly just mention a couple of the revolutions in the Caribbean. I'm not going to go into this in massive detail. Some of you might know the person on the left is Toussaint Louverture, who was one of the main leaders of the Haitian Revolution, really one of the only successful revolutions in the Caribbean that ended up with the first free Black Republic eventually. And then on the right, we have a mock-up of Julien Fedon, who was a mixed race man. His mother was originally an enslaved African woman, and his father was a French planter. And he was the leader of a rebellion that went on for about 18 months in Grenada, 1795 to 96. And these are relevant too to Scotland because it's generally Scottish military leaders who are on the other end of a lot of these battles that are happening. Now, Toussaint Louverture was said to be influenced by the more radical French Enlightenment ideas. And some cite Abbé Raynal. And of course, you know, people are also seeing the contradiction of the French Revolution crying liberty and equality, and meanwhile enslavement is still happening. What's interesting about the Haitian Revolution, just going to touch on this very briefly, is that we have a mingling of influences. We have the influence of voodoo and African spirituality, generally bringing a sense of strength and unity to people that are getting ready to fight for their freedom. So we have people like Cecile Fatiman and Boukman, Dutty Boukman, who are part of that first meeting where people start to plot the rebellion in 1791. So we need to think about different influences that come together. Now, Julien Fedon on the right, as I said, was influenced by French revolutionary thought, but also he's leading a rebellion partly because of the decades of anti-French repression, generally by Scots, up until this period. He actually was an enslaver himself. He was a slave owner or enslaver. He freed people that he had enslaved, and 40,000 enslaved people ended up joining this war of resistance, which very nearly became a free republic before Haiti. If we go to the next slide, I'm just going to show you a map of, so that's the mainland of Grenada. Grenada in itself is quite small, it's only 21 miles by 12. And then we see the smaller island up at the top, which is about 3 miles by 5, which is Carriacou Island, which is all part of Grenada now. So I'm just going to introduce the Philippe family, who originally came from that smaller island, Carriacou, and I'll give you a little bit of context for them. So it's a really unusual situation, is that we have a very wealthy, what they would have called free-coloured mixed race family. A family with a lot of variety. We have the matriarch of the family, who ended up on compensation when slave owners got compensated and so-called emancipation, 1834, she was actually compensated for the loss of her so-called property, 275 enslaved people that were working for her at that point, which she was compensated £6,000, which in those days for Grenada, she was one of the people that received one of the bigger payouts, especially as a free coloured person. She also has a brother, Joachim, who ends up fighting with Julien Fedon in the rebellion, and they don't catch him originally, but they catch him a few years later, and he ends up being executed in 1804. She also has a brother called Louis, who becomes one of the richest free coloured planters in Trinidad. So those of you who don't know, Trinidad is about 90 miles south of Grenada, so it's not too far. Louis' son is a man called Jean-Baptiste Philippe, who was actually born in Trinidad. So we're going to talk about him a little bit in a moment. Now, Trinidad had a very specific situation. There was a Spanish governor called Chacon, who, with the cedula of 1783, the decree, he encouraged people, not just white planters, but free coloured planters, to come with enslaved people from other islands. And if they came, they would get not only political rights, but also land grants. So they started to get used to having a lot of political power in Trinidad, and that was very unusual compared to other places in the Caribbean. Now, the British take over Trinidad in 1797, and they start to enact quite sneaky anti-free coloured laws. So they can't really do it outright, but what they do is bring in things like taxes to be paid on land by illegitimate children rather than legitimate children, which affected free coloured families more. Really enforcing a crown land policy. Or segregation, they start to bring in segregation, things like theatres and transportation like boats. So starting to create an atmosphere of repression for the free coloured community. Now, Jean-Baptiste Philippe, and we'll go to his slide now. Jean-Baptiste Philippe, who is Louis' son, was born in Trinidad. And so he's born in this wealthy family. He's used to having a lot of rights. He's used to having a lot of privileges. He's sent to Edinburgh to study, to be a doctor in 1812. Actually, his brother ends up coming to Edinburgh as well. And he graduates as a doctor in 1815. Now, he gets his degree, and goes back to Trinidad, and he's discriminated against on his return. So he's obviously very frustrated by this. Being a professional, he's expecting to be able to have his career. Now, while he's actually at Edinburgh University, he's immersed in discussions of Enlightenment thought. And when he goes back to Trinidad, he spends several months in 1823 lobbying for the rights of free coloureds. So he ends up gathering a petition, and he writes this very long address, a 300-page address, that he comes to London to deliver personally to the Secretary for the Colonies, who is Lord Bathurst at that point. And he comes with another lawyer who's a mixed race lawyer called John Conyers, and they come together and they deliver this because they also know that Lord Bathurst is somewhat liberal and wanting to perhaps change some of those laws. Now, what he says in the address is that, okay, we are not cultural equals yet. This is according to him. He is not pro-revolution, but he said you need to look carefully at what happened in Haiti and notice how that is developing as a state, and noticing that if people are given the opportunity, they are able to progress. And we need to think about this as well in context of similar petitions that were also coming from other places as well, which is starting to make America, especially the South, really anxious that free coloured people are starting to win rights or ask for their rights. He published this and names it Free Mulatto. It's called Free Mulatto in 1824. So we can think about him really being one of the first Caribbean authors that ends up being published. And he wins civil rights eventually for free coloureds. There were one in 1829, and unfortunately it's just after his death where Bathurst actually rules in favour of free coloureds. Now, the irony, of course, as is often the case, he says in the address that no privileges should be accorded just as a part of a society, basically when other people are suffering. But he's not fighting for the end of slavery. We know that slavery, of course, continues in Trinidad just like it did in the rest of the British Caribbean, right up until the end of the apprenticeship period in 1838. So I just wanted to share with you how some of the ideas that come out of the Enlightenment were used by different people, and the kinds of the ripple effect that happened in ways that people maybe not discussing here as much as they might be. So thank you very much.